Okay, this set of notes is going to be a continuation of the notes that we covered over the 1920s, and we're going to see a lot of economics here. And we talked about the economics of the 1920s, talked about a shift towards capitalism, less government involvement in the economy, and we talked about how that led to a boom but also led to some instability and riskiness in the economy. And so we're going to start here with really the beginning of the Great Depression and seeing how those risks really started the Great Depression. And so one thing we need to look at when we're going to look at kind of the whole economy and how it works and how one thing like the stock market crash spilled through the entire economy and really got us into a deep depression is we have to look at what makes an economy run, and that is credit. Defined here as the willingness of people to lend money and the ability of people to pay it back. So you maybe think of a credit score. You might have heard of that. When somebody's given a loan, are they able to pay that back? That's really what that's measuring. And so the ability of people to get loans and pay that money back really stimulates the economy, as we're going to see in this next slide. So this is a really rough, simplified explanation of how an economy can run off of credit. And so here we go. If we start in the center with a bank is a business, but one of the main things that banks do is they lend out money to people and to businesses. So when a bank lends money to people or an investor, someone that's trying to make money, they would give out a loan to that person. That person maybe wants to use that money to invest in things. Let's say, in this case, the stock market. So that investor, that person, is going to take that money from the bank and invest it in the stock market. All right. In the 1920s, as we know, the stock market was going up. And so hopefully their stock goes up, they sell, and they make a profit off of that investment. Now that investor has made a profit, and they have money left over to pay back to the bank. And of course, it's a loan, so they have to pay it back with interest to the bank, and everything's going well there. Banks also lend to businesses. And so let's say the bank gives a loan to a business, and that business wants to expand. That's what it's going to use the loan for. Maybe they want to build another factory, or they want to hire more workers in this case. So they can spend that money to hire more workers and be more productive. And those workers work very hard. The business does well, and they make a profit. Everything's going well. That business makes a profit, and then they can pay that money back to the bank with interest. This all works very well when credit is flowing. Bank can lend out money. People can use it to make profits and pay it back. In this case, though, if you focus on the stock market, and that's what we're going to look at, we had talked about buying stocks on margin and how that was very risky. The stock market crashes in October of 1929, and we'll see on this next slide how that can affect this whole process. So, if you look on your slide right here, use the last slide, and I'll give you a second here to try and fill this out, basically using the same steps we did on the last slide, starting with the stock market crash and how that can affect each step. So go ahead and pause the video and try to fill each step out here. I'll wait. Alright, if you filled this out, as I'm sure that you did, if you start at the very top with a stock market crash, people losing money in the stock market, you can then see that those investors that had invested in the stock market are going to lose money, which means that they can't pay their loans back to the banks, which therefore means that the banks are going to lose money on the loans that they had given out. So now the banks are affected, and they can't give out loans to other people or businesses. So now businesses are being affected. Businesses can't get loans to expand, hire new workers. So the businesses are going to slow their production, which means that if a business is struggling, they can't hire workers, so they might have to start laying off people. Now we've affected the individual. Workers now have less money if they've lost their job, which means workers and individuals can't buy things. They're not going to buy new products, and they certainly aren't going to invest in the stock market. So you can see how this whole system kind of cycles together and is just kind of spiraling downward. This is how credit in general can affect an entire economy. So one of the things we'll be doing in this unit is you'll be looking at photographs from the Great Depression and analyzing what that photograph can tell us about how people were affected during this depression. And so this is one of the more famous photographs from Dorothea Lange. And maybe you've seen this photograph before from the Depression. Some of the things you'll be doing are looking at, first of all, just what's in the photograph, which is of course important when you're analyzing a photograph, but also making inferences. We've talked about this before. What can you infer about the Depression based on what you see in that photograph? Here is another one that you can use to try to practice making inferences about how the Depression was affecting people's lives. So you can pause the video and take a look back at those photographs to practice what you'll be doing with the photo analysis assignment. One of the next things we'll be getting into is how the government tries to fix the Depression. And so the Depression happens in October of 1929. That's during Herbert Hoover's administration. And so he's president during this time. And he tries a couple things to alleviate the Depression. But keep in mind, as we said, we have a string of Republican presidents, capitalistic presidents that want less government involvement in the economy. So really, overall, the approach is pretty limited. So Hoover believed that the federal government should really stay out of trying to fix the Depression. It should be left up to local governments and state governments and individuals. And the federal government would only do more harm than good. But there were a few federal programs that happened on Hoover's watch to try to alleviate the Depression. One was, you probably heard of, is the Hoover Dam. This was meant to try to, a government program to put people back to work, and you've probably heard of the Hoover Dam before, and was seen as one of the big, actually, successes of Hoover's efforts to help fix the Depression. Some other programs, he instituted the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. These were both government programs to basically put people's confidence back in the banks, which we'll talk about, had really failed and were not giving out loans anymore. And were also a way for people to keep their homes. So it helped alleviate people who were losing their homes and couldn't pay their mortgages. So as we'll see in 1932, because of the Depression, Hoover gets basically blamed for it, and we see a big shift politically in the United States away from the capitalistic Republicans to Democrats, and that leads us to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So you can click on this link if it works for you to see a little background on Roosevelt and his effects, and just the new ideas that he had about government, about the economy. He, of course, has a very iconic inaugural address, which we'll see, but these are the 1932 presidential election results, and you can see Roosevelt beating Hoover here pretty handily. It really was not close. You can see how unpopular the Republicans were after a few years into the Depression. You also see, once again, legitimate votes for the socialist and communist parties. We've talked about that. So you can also click on these links to hear Roosevelt's inaugural address, his famous tagline, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And consider these questions. What's your overall impression of the speech? That was a very important inaugural address, considering the country was in really a moment when they didn't know what was going to happen next. Were we ever going to make it out of this Depression? Were we ever going to, was our system of government and way of life going to continue, or was this going to change everything? And also, how is FDR going to fix it? What's his plan to fix it? And so, as we see in the first 100 days, this becomes a key phrase of the administration. He basically pushes through a bunch of programs, and you can click on the link here, New Deal programs. This is his plan, the New Deal, and they're a drastic shift away from less government capitalistic ideas to much more government intervention in the economy, with the hope that it's going to stimulate the economy. This becomes known as the New Deal, and you will need to know a lot of these New Deal programs and what they do. So just to relate it to today, we have a couple New Deal programs that at least come out of that time period that are still around today. Social Security, you're probably familiar with that, and the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures your bank accounts. These both came around during the Depression and still affect us to today. So overall, to kind of recap, this is that same chart I had given you when we looked at the economics of the 1920s. At that time, I said that we were shifting more to the capitalistic side of things, government having less power in the economy, people having more freedom. But as we saw, that led to a big boom in the economy, but also some instability, and led to the Depression. Once Roosevelt comes into power, we see a dramatic shift going the other way, and we're going to look more into this. But as part of the New Deal and other government programs that Roosevelt institutes, we see a shift towards much more government power in the economy. Ultimately, what you will need to do is this whole new plan of Roosevelt's called the New Deal, with more government intervention in the economy. You will have to determine by looking at statistics if this plan, the New Deal, was successful or not. And so we'll be doing something we haven't looked at a lot this year, that is statistics, and being able to analyze and interpret statistics to determine your answer to this question.